Good morning, Alex. How are you? It seems a long time since I saw you.
Less than 24 hours. We are literally in each other's company every single day at the moment. We're doing some very exciting new things, which is very, very special.
Yes, we filmed a special edition of the podcast for next week.
Yeah, with some incredible guests. I cannot wait to see how that one turns out. So I'm very excited.
Which might be going up online a little early.
Yes, stay tuned, keen listeners. But in the meantime, I think we're going from excitement to tragedy with this episode of the WhatsOnStage podcast.
Well, we've been talking a lot in our many meetings about stage disasters, partly because when we did our stocking fillers episode, I recommended a book about Carrie called Out for Blood, which interestingly was based on a podcast, a 15-episode podcast about the stage disaster that was the RSC's Carrie. So we thought we'd devote this episode of the WhatsOnStage podcast to many stage disasters, lots for the price of one. And if that's probably a good moment then to say, welcome to this week's WhatsOnStage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
And I'll talk a bit about Carrie. What fascinates me about stage disasters is that they very often have an overreach at their centre. So there are actually, when you start to read up about them, there are so many things that go wrong on stage. And I should preface all of this by saying that I am always struck when reading and thinking about stage disasters by the general nobility and dignity of the people who are caught up in them. They always carry on working and they carry on enduring and they carry on persisting in an attempt to bring the show to the stage. And many of them emerge with some credit at the end. So that's the context in which I talk about Carrie. But the thing about Carrie really was, Carrie the musical, was that the RSC were involved. And the RSC were involved because Les Miserables had been so successful and the RSC had been involved in that. And I think that may have misled everybody into thinking that when Dean Pitchford and Michael Gore came along and pitched the idea of doing a musical version of Brian De Palma's film based on a novel by Stephen King, that it was a good idea and that it was going to make money. And that almost immediately, this is in the 1980s, when the RSC is struggling for cash and when there is huge debate in the papers about the role of subsidised theatre. So from the second that Carrie is announced, there is outrage, really, in the press, and people are really worked up about the idea of a company that gets taxpayers' money, that was how it was always framed, being involved in a big Broadway show. It is fascinating that people really resisted it. I'm not sure that would actually happen now. I think people are so much more comfortable with the idea of a commercial producer being involved in a subsidised section.
I'd say even since the pandemic, that's become more the norm. I remember when, I think it was Pinocchio, wasn't it, that was done at the National Theatre. There were a few raised eyebrows about Disney working with the National, even though the National was a subsidised venue. Obviously, Pinocchio then never had any future life and was considered a bit of a dud, but not on a Carrie level. And it's important to preface that these are theatre, not disasters in the sense of venues burning down and sort of like huge sort of like structural calamity, but more of an artistic calamity where things have gone wrong. And as much as Pinocchio is a slight flop, I don't think it comes anywhere close to what happened at the RSC and beyond, as you are about to give us in painful detail, Sarah.
Well, possibly not painful detail, given that we've got a lot of ground to cover. But it is true that there was, rumour has it, and I think to some extent this is apocryphal, but it's also embedded in the legend of Carrie, that there were two separate things going on in the mind of the director, Terry Hands, and the choreographer and rest of the creative team. The choreographer was Debbie Allen, who'd had huge success at that time with Fame, which was also where Pitchford and Gore came from. So Fame, the musical, is the sort of in the background to the creation of Fame the Musical, the film, Alan Parker's film. The rumour is that when they started to talk about it, obviously it's a story of Carrie, a disturbed teenage girl who has a super religious mother. They are in conflict. She has her first period. The joke all along is, an $8 million musical about a girl having a period. That's all the time, the joke about this show. She has her first period. Something terrible happens to her at the school prom. And from that, and she destroys everything around her with her telekinetic powers. So when the creators were pitching the idea to the director, Terry Hands, they said, think about Grease. And what they meant was Grease the musical and the whole vibe of that, of the high school gym and everything. Terry Hands is an associate director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's a very serious-minded director. And what he thought about was Greek tragedy. So he is in a different version of Grease. And whether or not this is true, that essential tension between Debbie Allen, who's drilling a team of dancers to gyrate and jive and be like American teenagers, and Hans, who is essentially saying, I want you to think of yourself as a Greek chorus. We're going to have very neutral costumes that are sort of reminiscent of togas. That divide, almost from the off, destroys the idea of the musical as far as I can see. The other divide that destroyed it was the divide between, it was British and American. It was premiered at the RSC for a short run and then went to Broadway very quickly. It doesn't get out of time tryouts. It doesn't get previews. It really flings itself onto the stage, almost when it knows it's going to be a disaster. I think there's a strong sense, as you read about Carrie, that people knew that it was doomed from really quite early on. And certainly Barbara Cook, who turns up to take the leading role of the mother and just can't wait to get out of it. And in fact does leave after the Stratford run. She never gets to Broadway. And she realises when she turns up that she's got the wrong voice for the part. They needed somebody with a much bigger voice. And that the show isn't working, that Hans isn't really directing it. He's kind of doing very detailed work with actors. But he was a hands-off director, I mean, according to the descriptions, pun intended. And so his gentle British, I just won't interfere here, doesn't really sit well with a musical based on a horror film. And it's also, the other reason Cook leaves is that on the first night in Stratford, there is a famous scenery malfunction, which is very vividly, critics have a role to play in the success or otherwise of Carrie. And the scenery malfunction was really vividly described by people like, among them, Matt Wolfe, who was writing then for the Chicago Tribune and is still writing for various publications today. It had a very complicated, though apparently simple set. And as it moves out of the way, it looks as if Cook is about to be decapitated. A bit of ceiling comes in and hangs over her head. And it is really nearly a total disaster. It is a dangerous moment, but the stage crew manage it brilliantly. But all the audience could see, and all indeed Cook could see, is this bit of scenery that looks as if it's about to fall on her. And that did not improve her mood. And she said, she gave an interview to Baz Voice saying, I can't wait to be out of this. It's such chaos. So Charles Spencer of my old parish, of the writing for the Daily Telegraph, is one of the many critics who could put the boot in that night, and his review is worth reading.
It's very interesting how critics themselves play such a vital part in the infamy that a show can produce. They are the ones that create the narrative that this is a dud or this has artistically failed. And one thing that has recurred time and again is that as much as some shows are commercial failures, they only truly become disasters when they are artistic and commercial failures. There is that sense, as you say, that some shows can be really impressive on an artistic level but just never resonate with an audience, so they lose a lot of money, but sometimes that's fine if the art itself justifies the cost. But when a huge amount of money has been spent and what is produced is essentially an overblown theatre turkey that can jeopardise the lives of performers and backstage teams, you know something is very, very wrong. And Carrie is the pitch perfect example of that. Although I would say, and we've mentioned this on the podcast before, that Carrie has found another life. It has become a cult musical that people now love, and it had an off West End revival, which then sort of led to it being sort of like a big hit amongst the TikTok crew and the millennials and Gen Zs. So I think that it might really come back. It might work its magic on musical audiences properly, and I've heard rumblings that it might actually be back in probably a slightly less ambitious and more cohesive production, which might actually mean the material works, rather than having two people who misinterpret the word grease and take it in completely different directions.
Yeah, and I mean, by the time it gets to Broadway, where it lasts for 6 previews and 5 performances, I think that makes it the fastest closing show still of all time, though it's got rivals. What's interesting about it then is that they've changed. So by that point, Terry Hands is seeing it as a Jacobean tragedy, and they do start to sort of take out bits of the book. So it gets shorter. It loses about a quarter of an hour by the time it gets to Broadway. But it also loses all coherence in the changes that are made. And it never gets over what Charlie described as a couple of conjuring tricks, which would seem dull by the end of peer standards. And of course, what's now changed since 1988 is you could get better conjuring tricks. I mean, theatre magic and theatre technology is much more capable of producing the kind of effects that Carrie probably needed. So, yeah, I think I can see that it will come back, possibly, because it wasn't the worst idea in the world. The other thing that happens when you say about it's very hard to escape a critical drubbing and an audience drubbing. Audiences got behind Carrie quite early, partly because Lizzie Haitley, who was the cast from drama school as the lead, was brilliant. And also on Broadway, Betty Buckley comes in to save the day as the mother and is brilliant. So there was always a sense in which the cast got the reviews and it was the show and the production that was panned. So yeah, it is interesting. But it's hard to write those reviews. There is that description of, you know, as in the old days, the papers coming out and the cast gathering and reading the reviews and just knowing that they were finished.
You never know, Lindsay Haitley might be back for a revival of the production. She can play the mother and come full circle. Yeah,
which actually, oddly, Patricia Hodge did with Pippin, which is a critical success and audience disaster. Pippin, it's one of those. But yeah, Patricia Hodge has come back in a revival.
Yeah, she was amazing in it, yeah.
There are shows like Anyone Can Whistle, that very early Sondheim, that people keep bringing back because it's got great songs in it, but actually doesn't work. And we might do another episode on what makes something revivable.
Which shows have had the Lazarus experience of, you know, the Merrily We Roll Along coming back from, you know, the edge of the river Styx and being celebrated for the artistic success that it is when all think that it has perished and will be confined to the dustbin of history.
Yeah, lasted 43 performances on Broadway, incredible short Broadway run, Merrily We Roll Along.
And now one of the most commercially successful Sondheim productions ever. So, yeah.
Extraordinary that.
Yeah.
Yes, let's come back and do Merrily We Roll Along.
Yes.
But in the meantime, Alex,
yes,
what's your first disaster?
So, I'm going to go back to World War One. This is an odd point of departure. So, I don't know if you studied this at school, but what we were always taught is that the reason that World War One started is because there were so many engines in motion that once Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, so many things sprang into action that no one could really stop it, even though they probably should. And the one thing that struck me about Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, which is my first pick, and has been very well documented, like Carrie the Musical, is that it felt so gargantuan a production that even though there were probably lots of people along the way saying, maybe we shouldn't do this, maybe we should stop, maybe this is too ambitious, maybe this is something that should be a universal theme park rather than on Broadway, no one actually, you know, pulled the escape cord and things carried on. And that for me was really striking, going through the history of the show, the litany of commercial and artistic failures that took place, and ultimately, you know, people suffered quite severe injuries backstage and on stage, and ambition clearly just took over, and there were people worrying about the bottom line, so they thought, we just need to get this on and make a bit of money. But so many calamities took place along the way. So let's go to 2002, just before Spider-Man is released in cinemas, the Sam Raimi film. At this point, the producer Tony Adams was excited about the idea of making a Spider-Man musical, and roped in really one of the most exciting creative teams seen on any show, really. So you've got U2 legends, Bono and The Edge, doing the music, and Julie Taymor, who at that point was basking in the glorious international success of The Lion King, the biggest Broadway musical ever, really, at that point, all coming together and saying, let's take the story of the greatest superhero, Spider-Man, and turn it into a musical. And at that point you think, what could go wrong? You've got the coolest superhero, the coolest band, and the coolest director all coming together. However, this is where the problems start. So unfortunately, Tony Adams suffered a stroke in 2005 during the development process and died a couple of days later. And he really was the driving force behind the project. He would have been the glue holding it all together. Then at the same time, you've got the financial crash in 2008, and then a lot of investors got very concerned. So suddenly there's a multi-million-pound black hole. I sound like a Labour government here. There's a black hole at the heart of the production.
It's very easy to sound like a government when you're talking about musical disasters.
Yeah, and it is also, it's funny how these Broadway disasters always involve musicals. You never hear about a play disaster on Broadway. Anyway, that's an interesting aside. The rehearsals began, and quickly it became apparent that they weren't going to meet their preview date at the Lyric Theatre on Broadway. It's now called the Lyric Theatre. I think it was something else back in 2010. So they finally opened in late 2010. But again, huge problems arose, both with the material but also with the production. And, there were a series of major injuries during previews. And this was really one of the first Broadway viral moments. I don't know if you saw it in late 2010, when one of the performers leapt off a platform and fell into the orchestra pit, and their bungee rope snapped. And to this, it's a haunting video, and it was spread like wildfire across the internet in a way that, if TikTok had existed in 2010, this would have been ratcheting up millions upon millions of views. So there was a sort of stink of a problem around the production itself. Before we even get onto the material, there was the sense that this was a Spider Turkey rather than a Spider-Man kind of musical.
I do remember it. I remember it quite vividly because I was arts editor on the Telegraph at the time, and barely a day passed without my being asked about the progress of Spider-Man on Broadway, because it did generate such excitement. And when that film came out, there was a huge panic, really, the show that everybody had been treating as light entertainment. It was funny that actors were ending up in hospital with sprained wrists, and suddenly it wasn't really funny because it was a frightening film. And I remember my own sense of panic about it, because as a journalist and as an arts editor, you're always worried that you're going to miss the big story. And it was hard to keep track of Spider-Man in a non-digital world. It wasn't really digital then. And, you were reliant on Variety telling you things, and it was much harder to get information. And I had a daily phone call with people about what was happening on Spider-Man. It just went on. And the press night got pushed back and back and back.
It currently holds the record for the longest preview period of any production on Broadway. There were over 180 previews, 182 in total. And in a similar way, a lot of the critics didn't want to miss the story either. So in a mass protest, they all went and reviewed the previews and sort of gave it scathing reviews. And anyone who knows how the theatre ecosystem works, to break an embargo and go into a preview is to some extent it kind of betrays the relationship that exists between critics and creative, that we do allow them time to get things right. But, all the critics on Broadway just sort of, their patience ran out and they just thought, we're going in. we're going to do this, and the knives were drawn, and it was eviscerated in those initial preview reviews. One of the key issues that arose was the fact that Julie Taymor wanted to introduce this villain Arachne, who, for those who know, is the Greek character who is transformed into a spider for annoying a few gods. She was just considered, not really, she wasn't grounded in Spider-Man canon, so all the Marvel aficionados weren't exactly excited about, when there's a litany of incredible villains that you could choose as your primary antagonist. She choose this Greek villainess. Again, for some reason, it's all about the Greeks. The moment the Greeks get involved, the calamity ensues.
Nightmare.
Yeah. So this was all Taymor's idea, and a lot of people were saying that the plot was far too convoluted and messy. And what then happened in April 2011 is, and this is really one of the most extreme things that a producer can do, is essentially they all said, right, we're closing for now, we're taking time out, we're going to retool the production. And so Taymor was thrown out because they said, we don't need this Arachne villain, we need this rejigged, and we need the Green Goblin, who is one of Spider-Man's most famous adversaries, to become the lead villain, played by Patrick Page, who then went on to play Hades in Hadestown, which is funny because Reeve Carney, who's also in Hadestown, is playing Spider-Man. So those two were facing off in that area as well. So Taymor was so wedded to Arachne, or webbed, I guess, that when they said that we really want Arachne out, she basically left the production, which for a director who'd been driving it for so long to leave shows just how dire the situation was. So David Ezra Lowe was brought in, and Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa was brought onto the writing team. And then eventually they stumbled right the way through to opening night in June 2011. And what was kind of sad is that actually it got some relatively decent write-ups at that point. People said, if with the right development process, there could have been something quite interesting here, or at least something visually interesting. I think this was part of the problem, in that there was just consistent problems with the web slinging and the sort of like flying across stage. I think one producer said at one point it looked like the actor had been sort of strung up like a piñata, which when you've got Spider-Man meant to be sort of like this really cool hip superhero looking like he's flailing around in a theatre, any sense of visual spectacle completely disappears.
Again, it's the limitations of stage technology, isn't it? And also trying to prove a point, trying to say the Marvel Universe, because I think they did want to do Spider-Man to bring in different audience. I think that was very much the idea, that just as in cinema, Spider-Man and Marvel began to build a different audience, they wanted to do the same thing in theatre, which is not entirely stupid, but possibly nobody felt strongly enough about it to find a way of making it work. I never know with that.
Yeah, and I think that the loss of Tony Adams was probably a huge blow to everyone because it was his vision initially. One question I ask is, would the material have been good if it wasn't saddled by a nightmare production? Sadly, one of the worst answers I can give is no. And you can listen to the cast recording that Bono and The Edge put together, and the music sounds like AI trying to write new songs for U2. It's drivel, really, not to put too fine a point on it. Yeah. Yes, and like there's some weird techno numbers where the Green Goblin sounds like he's singing a New Order song, which is called A Freak Like Me Needs Company. And no one would ever have expected that the Green Goblin would be singing a New Order style song about self-expression, but here we go. So I just think it was misjudged. Well, if anyone
wants to put it on in a studio theatre with using your imagination, maybe we could all have a listen. I'm not going to book for it. I feel that's what I'm going to let go.
Maybe we should get Jamie Lloyd to do a production where he's some sort of like stripped back Spider-Man in a t-shirt sort of situation, using webcam or cameras to sort of create the idea of web slinging. That might be a bit more artistically interesting.
Think it's a lot to ask even of Jamie Lloyd, that one. I mean, very often it is that sense of being saddled with infinite ambition that lands you in trouble. I'm always, when we were thinking about this, I was very struck by Nicholas Heitner's remembrance of his play Greenland, which was a portmanteau play about climate change. And it was written in response to the climate emergency. And both of us have just seen the excellent Kyoto at Soho Place, which tackles the climate emergency with great brilliance. And also Richard Bean, about the same time as Greenland, wrote a very good play called The Heretic, which was about climate change and climate scepticism, not to be confused with the Hugh Grant film of the same name. But Greenland was, for all the efforts of those involved, an irredeemable stinker. And Heine's very graceful about it in his book. He says all the actors were brilliant and all the writing was brilliant, but what the National actually put on as a production was a reconstituted Turkey, because they took little bits of lots of things and rammed them all together. And the other quality that I think that disasters very often have in common is length, that they manage to make things... I can't think of many that have been short disasters. They're nearly always plays or musicals that exhaust everybody, including the audience. And the other quality I would say about them is that the directorial vision goes wrong at some point, that you end up with a director who is trying to do one thing and other people in the production maybe are trying to do another. And I am going to return on this theme to The Architect and the Emperor of Assyria, which is this book that I've mentioned before by Jackie Harvey, who was a fledgling stage manager at the National Theatre at the Old Vic under Laurence Olivier. And this play, which was by Fernando Arrabal, was put on partly because the National Theatre wanted to do something avant-garde. It was completely driven by Kenneth Tynan, and he was determined, because the censorship rules had been loosened and because he wanted to introduce European theatre into Britain, that he was going to put this play on almost from the first as disaster. And Laurence Olivier, who was in charge at the time and who was, an old fox in terms of his Machiavellian machinations about keeping everybody inside, he asked Jackie Harvey to write a diary to warn him if things are going wrong. And she faithfully records it. And what's so brilliant about this book, I was rereading it this morning, the tone with which she records it all is quite different than you get when you record something for posterity, because she's recording it for the boss. And she's got brilliant lines that the real problem with the show, it had multiple problems, but the real problem was the director, who was called Anthony Garcia, who was, in Tynan's words, not a director in the bourgeois sense of the word. And he was a poet and a radical and a revolutionary. He had great success in European theatre. But he's a director who doesn't come to quite a lot of his own rehearsals, who never really directs, is always asking the actors, who are Jim Dale and Anthony Hopkins, to live in the moment. And he bursts into tears all the time, and her descriptions of him sitting in the stalls and sobbing as something happens on the stage. And they lost the ability to interpret whether he was sobbing because he didn't like what he was seeing or because he was being treated badly. And it's full of insight. Anthony Hopkins is incredibly funny about his own involvement in this. It was a two-hander lasting hours. And there's one famous scene where they were rehearsing it and Jim Dale thought, God, that's amazing what Anthony Hopkins is doing. He's banging his head against a metal unit to show frustration. That's such a brilliant acting technique. And then he realised he was just doing it because Hopkins was in such total despair and frustration that in the end, the stage crew used to line themselves up in front of any heating unit so he couldn't bang his head on it. And Hopkins says now that he does this little introduction. He said that the whole experience led him to believe that any director who said he was going to go on a journey in rehearsal was somebody who, for Hopkins, the door was marked exit. He was just going out. But it's wonderfully written and wonderfully done. And what's amazing is they do get it on, and you emerge from the book with such admiration for the actors. And it was reflected, again, looking at the reviews, because I do think disasters are interesting for what they tell you. Coming out of the reviews was complete and utter admiration for Dale and Hopkins. And I'll just tell you one last thing. The other thing that they were determined to have nudity. in this production.
Which at the time, that was a radical thing.
Yes. Sorry, I should be telling you the year.
Would a Lord Chamberlain have possibly chimed in with something quite negative if they tried?
It's 1970. So the Lord Chamberlain has just lifted off restrictions, which was the excitement of possibly having nudity. And the director keeps saying things like, why don't you take your underpants off? I always find it helps. And Dale and Hopkins, apart from one moment, defiantly keep their underwear on. And Olivier, when faced with hearing these reports coming out of the rehearsal rooms that there was going to be nudity, told the stage director that he planned to have two men standing in the hall, in the wings, with towels. And should any sign of nudity appear, they were going to rush on with a towel to prevent it. In fact, it didn't happen. It was performed in briefs. But Dale and Hopkins were heroic against all odds, and so were the stage crew, who were fighting things like there was a giant forklift truck, and the director didn't tell the stage crew the height, and it wouldn't ever extend in the rehearsal room. So they could never rehearse with the truck at its full height. Brilliant. It's nice. Brilliant. Stage Managing Chaos, this book's called. And it's the best off-the-cuff, instantaneous record of a disaster. Rivalled only, actually, by Timothy West's memories of working with Peter O'Toole, which I might do at the end if we've got time. But tell me your...
Yes.
You're next.
So it's funny how this show's failure feels like it sums up quite a few of the talking points that we've come through before, including creative misdirection, being too long, woefully sort of misguided from the start, and possibly trying to emulate the success of something better. And have you watched the Disney Plus series Shogun?
I have watched the first episode, and I am determined to watch more. It's brilliant.
That's exactly what I've done as well. And I thought, I need a rainy few days to go through this.
I need to finish watching ER, which I'm watching for about the fifth time. Anyhow, carry on.
So Shogun is based on the Disney Plus series is based on the 1975 novel by James Clavell, and was also adapted into a multi-part series in 1980. So this is the second TV adaptation. But there were hopes, and Clavell actually drove this, for it to be turned into a stage musical, which was sort of fueled on by the success of things like Les Mis or Phantom of the Opera. Les Mis has got a lot to answer for, actually. Because I think it does.
Go on.
Yeah, so the story follows a shipwrecked Englishman who is sort of drawn into a political power struggle in 17th century Japan. So almost similar to something like Twelfth Night. Maybe they should have just made a musical Twelfth Night instead. It has lyrics by John Driver and music by Paul Chihara, and sort of had sort of like a pre-Broadway tryout in Washington, which is good because Spider-Man never had a pre-Broadway run, which maybe might have helped, which was where they started identifying there were some major problems. And it came in at 4 hours long when it first started, and people were just completely baffled by what was going on. The accounts say there was a fascinating deep dive in the LA Times that came out in 1991 saying how the first complete run-through of the show was its opening night performance. So all the way through previews, it was changing. And one of the actresses who was playing the lead said she had to write her lines on props because they kept changing every night. So she had to keep track of what she had to say. And it was almost like that's a gag in The Play That Goes Wrong, where someone will lift up a vase and it has their line underneath because they need to remember what their cue is. And it's like, this is very much the musical that goes wrong. And so Peter Carrie, who's a British musical legend, was actually fired before Broadway. And then Philip Kasnoff was brought in to lead the show when it came to Broadway. And he said during rehearsals for Broadway that he had no idea what was going on, and he had read the novel, which is, pretty much a damning indictment. So by the time it got to Broadway, the show's playbill had a huge, exhaustive plot synopsis so that everyone could actually follow what was going on. Part of the problem was that the director, who was Michael Smuin, decided to focus on the choreography because he was a choreographer at heart. So even though for this huge political intrigue storyline with grappling factions and feuding families, there would be these extended ballet passages that just didn't work at all, and people were like, why am I watching ballet when it's meant to be this political thriller musical? So it does feel as though everyone had the best of intentions, but it all just completely started falling apart. And Kasnoff was actually struck by a piece of set. So similar, again, to Carrie, where there was the potential for a stage disaster. All the critics picked up on this, and they said that was the most interesting thing about the show, was when he had to take a 15-minute pause to sort of get his bearings. Thankfully, he carried on, but that's, again, pretty awful if you're reading the reviews the next day, and the one thing you had no control over, and that was probably a huge health and safety risk, was the most interesting thing that took place at the Marquee Theatre that night. Interestingly, the cast had Joanne M. Hunter in it, who has now gone on to choreograph a lot of Andrew Lloyd Webber's musicals. So at least she managed to survive unscathed. But yes, it might not be one of the greatest stage disasters, but it definitely feels like it sums up how badly things can go wrong. And seemingly time and again, this seems to be the case. And I think Broadway is a very merciless ecosystem, in that if something is sort of already sounding like a lame duck, it has no chance of really surviving. New York audiences very much will sort of put things out into the cold if they don't think it's going to be a success, and there's very little chance of sort of rehabilitating yourself.
Yeah, reading about these things makes you realise why actors and directors do talk so much about collaboration, because so often if somebody had listened to somebody right at the start, the disaster would have been avoided and they would actually have put a show on that everybody wanted to see. I agree with you that all of the ones that we've looked at, and I think this could be a recurring series, do have these qualities in common that of technical difficulties, but also at the heart of them a sort of artistic incomprehensibility, really, where one person or maybe a number of people are pulling in one direction, everybody else is going in the other direction. And the intentions are generally good, but the execution is almost doomed to failure from that starting point. You can see the problems when you begin. And I wanted to end just with one other disaster. I realised that I've been at a lot of these disasters. I never saw Spider-Man, but I did see Viva Forever, which is another famous a musical based on the Spice Girls, where they actually tried to use bad reviews for the show. So they said to people, the reviews may say this thing, but the audiences love it. And that is the other interesting thing. Audiences often do get on side and they try and support it. But in the case of Peter O'Toole's Macbeth, the audiences got on side and bought the tickets because they wanted to see the disaster. And they had heard it was a disaster. And indeed, it was a disaster. I mean, famously, he appeared at the top of a staircase, drenched from head to foot in blood, and said, "I have done the deed," and then staggered down the staircase. It was very funny and very tragic simultaneously, because you felt an awful lot of talent and careers were being wasted. And right at the beginning of it, Timothy West, who is running the Old Vic at that time, is presented with a contract by O'Toole, who hadn't been on stage for 15 years, hadn't done any Shakespeare since his Hamlet in 1963. And it says Peter O'Toole has full artistic control of this production. And from the minute West signed that, I would suggest that the show was doomed, because O'Toole had no idea really of how to do it. He knew how to do it. He knew how to act. Even through the madness, he gave a performance, but he had no idea how to direct, how to put on a production. He brings in somebody that he knows from Ireland called La Botta Limited, who designed the first set, which was a lot of black dustbin bags inflated that fitted in the boot of a car for touring purposes. I mean, it's just like mental that it ever got on. And, everybody should have called it a day, but the audiences loved it. I sort of loved it. I saw it in Coventry and was embarrassed for all concerned, but also was very conscious that I was at something that was historic in its own way.
No, you're totally right about why did no one say this needs to stop now. And I think we've both been to workshops of new musicals where we thought, okay, there's something here, but this isn't right. So, we should all just get off this bus and get onto something else and enjoy it whilst it lasted. But this is where this project should come to an end. And is there a sense of collective delusion that allows a group of people to just continue, even though they're probably heading into what is essentially could be a complete disaster. Like, obviously with actors, you've got to bear in mind the fact they need a job and they want to just pay their bills and they want to pay their mortgage. But, you know, for the producers and people further up the chain, why haven't they just decided, you know, maybe it would just be better if we just revived Bye Bye Birdie, because there's no point putting on something new here. It's beautiful in a certain way, isn't it, I suppose?
The psychology is riveting, and I always quote Lin-Manuel Miranda, who says you could learn as much from what you don't like as what you do. And I think it's true that with disasters, you can learn a lot. If any wannabe director just wanted to sit down and read accounts of theatrical disasters, they would learn a lot, because they do have a psychology all of their own, and they're utterly riveting to read about. I want to correct one thing before we go off. I said that Merrily We Roll Along had 43 performances. I was nearly right. It had 44 previews on Broadway, the first production, 16 performances, and then closed, which is astonishing given that it is now one of the biggest grossing musicals of all time.
Wow.
And about to be a movie.
Yes,
so you can come back from disaster.
About to be a movie is a bit of that's employing a lot of artistic license, because we won't be seeing it for a couple of decades. So. Thank you, Richard Linklater, for that. Yeah. Well, on that note,
I might not even ever see it.
Well, hopefully.
I'll hang on. I'm going to hang on. I'm going to live long enough to watch Man United win the league again and to see the Merrily We Roll Along movie. It's a good aspiration, actually.
That would be the final rehabilitation of that musical. It's the last step. And Sondheim's Ghost will be smiling down as people finally realise how much of an artistic genius he was in making that show. Perfect. But indeed. I think on that positive note, with a shred of rehabilitation for some failed and doomed shows, I think it's probably a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And a goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and rate the podcast wherever you can. We'll be back next week with a very special episode of the What's on Stage podcast, including some lovely guests. So make sure you tune in then.